Welcome to our deep dive. We'll be exploring navigating emotions at work, using Liz Fosslien and Mollie West Duffy's No Hard Feelings as our guide.
Even the dedication is interesting, right? To our families with the greatest emotion of all, love. It's like they're reminding us that, work isn't just about, well, work. It's about people.
And the emotions we bring to those interactions, for
hmm
sure. Let's introduce Liz and Mollie. Liz comes from an analyst background,
And Molly from product management.
but they both struggled with work stress.
It's interesting. Liz battled depression and anxiety.
And Mollie.
Well, she experienced really intense anxiety, so intense it caused what they call emotional numbness.
You'd think they'd be experts at handling emotions at work then, right?
Ironically, their collaboration on this very book was, well, it was tough, lots of miscommunication. They actually even used couples therapy to improve their working relationship.
Wow. That really speaks to the book's main point. Even the most emotionally intelligent among us can struggle.
Exactly. And that's, it's okay.
Okay, let's dive into their first big idea. The future is emotional. They begin with an interesting story about Howard Schultz, the Starbucks CEO.
Oh, I love this story.
He cried in front of his employees back in 2008.
Mm,
Not your typical CEO move.
right. It's such a powerful example of vulnerability. He didn't try to, hide his emotions. He acknowledged the company's struggles and his own very openly. And then he shared a concrete plan and asked for feedback.
And what happened?
He got immense respect, like thousands of appreciative emails.
Makes you think, what if more leaders embrace vulnerability? Would workplace culture be different?
It's an interesting question. The book argues that instead of ignoring our emotions at work, we should acknowledge them. They actually use Liz's own story as an example. She had to decide whether to stay in San Francisco or take a job at Genius in New York. Have you ever been in a situation like that, trying to figure out how a decision will make you feel in the future?
Oh, all the time.
Right. Well, the book talks about something called impact bias. It's basically when we overestimate how intense and how long our future feelings will be.
And this leads to,
Miswanting. We choose things we think will make us happy, but often they don't. It's like, remember that Warren Buffett joke, the one about saving up sex for old age?
okay, I see where you're going with this.
It's kind of like choosing a job we hate just to build a resume, right? Sacrificing our present contentment for a future that may not even turn out the way we hope.
We're delaying gratification, but with no guarantee of a payoff.
Right. And the book emphasizes that it's not about chasing fleeting happiness. It's about striving for contentment.
Contentment.
It comes from accepting that life, including work, has ups and downs.
It's about, finding fulfillment in the journey itself.
Mm.
That makes sense. So what about health and well-being at work?
They start with a quiz about work anxiety, and it's surprisingly relatable.
I know. Then they talk about the science behind stress and how it affects us physically.
Chronic stress can lead to all sorts of problems. Fatigue, burnout, even physical illness.
It's like running on a treadmill forever. Eventually, you just can't keep going.
Exactly. They suggest some solutions, and it all ties back to contentment. Like taking mini breaks throughout the day, having after-work rituals, even using Cal Newport's schedule shutdown complete routine to separate work from personal life.
When did you last actually unplug after work?
Oh, that's a good question. It feels like ages. I'm always checking emails or on work-related social media.
They talk about that too, the positivity paradox. Some companies encourage positivity but don't give space to process negative emotions. It's like expecting everyone to just smile all the time while ignoring what might be causing the stress.
So how do we combat that toxic positivity?
They suggest building a challenge network. It's not just a support system, it's people who will give you honest feedback, help you confront problems.
Like a trusted advisor who gives it to you straight.
Exactly. And they stress advocating for clear expectations at work. Uncertainty just breeds anxiety. That's a good point. Let's move on to motivation and its drivers. They focus on four things people often lack motivation in: autonomy, meaning, learning, and relationships. Starting with autonomy.
Remember that Destiny's Child lyric, "Ain't no feeling like being free." It captures that sense of intrinsic motivation you get from controlling your own work.
That sounds amazing, but is that realistic for everyone?
They provide some good examples, like the ROWE program at Best Buy, which gave employees complete schedule control. As long as they met their goals, they could work whenever they wanted. It actually reduced absenteeism and turnover, proving that autonomy can boost productivity and morale.
So even in industries not known for autonomy, it can work.
Right. And for places where total autonomy isn't possible, they suggest creating mini moments of freedom, taking time to read, going for a walk, even just choosing how to tackle a task.
It's about finding those pockets of self-direction.
Exactly. Now, what about dopamine and the brain's reward system?
I'm curious about that.
They talk about things like slot machines and checking email, activities that keep us hooked even when the rewards are unpredictable. It's the anticipation, the potential for that dopamine hit that drives us.
So our brains are wired to seek out excitement, even if it's fleeting.
Yeah. And they actually suggest creating your own reward system. Liz used ice cream to stay motivated. It's about figuring out what incentivizes you, what makes you want to get things done.
Like hacking your own brain. That's really clever.
Uh,
Okay, on to finding meaning in your work.
they emphasize connecting our work to a bigger purpose. They use the example of scholarship fundraisers at the University of Pennsylvania, who doubled their performance after meeting the students they were helping. Seeing the impact of their work motivated them.
It's a good reminder that even small tasks can contribute to something meaningful.
Right. They also introduce this idea of job crafting. It's about actively shifting our focus to parts of our work that resonate with us.
Like finding meaning within our existing roles.
Exactly. They give examples like a barista who enjoys brightening people's day with their coffee, or a graphic designer who takes pride in creating meaningful cards.
And then there's Paquita Williams, the MTA conductor, who sees herself as a caretaker for her passengers.
Exactly. It's about reframing your perspective to find meaning, even in unexpected places.
Okay, now on to viewing work as a place to learn. Liz actually took a Starbucks job as a transition gig, but ended up discovering a passion for design.
It just goes to show that you never know where you'll learn something new.
Exactly. She learned Photoshop, Illustrator, and it opened up a whole new world for her.
It's a good reminder to stay open to opportunities for growth.
They also talk about Molly's experience with a colleague who was always jumping between jobs, searching for the perfect role.
The problem is they missed out on valuable learning experiences along the way.
Right. So it's about reframing work as a journey of discovery.
Especially in today's world. Continuous learning is crucial. They even mention the World Economic Forum's prediction that half of today's children will end up in jobs that don't even exist yet.
Wow. That's a lot of pressure to adapt and keep learning.
It is, but they offer some tips, like swapping skills with colleagues, prioritizing mental health, even starting side projects to explore new interests.
It's about creating a mindset of growth.
Yeah.
So we've covered well-being, motivation, finding meaning, and the importance of learning. What's next?
Well, we still need to talk about workplace friendships, how to make better decisions, and building psychological safety in teams.
Sounds like we have a lot more to unpack. Join us for part 2 as we continue this deep dive into no hard feelings.
Welcome back to our No Hard Feelings deep dive. We were discussing some pretty insightful stuff.
Right, like autonomy and finding meaning in our work.
Mhm.
But I'm really curious about the next part, decision-making and emotional intelligence. We always hear about trusting our gut.
But this section argues that maybe we shouldn't rely on gut feelings so much, especially when it comes to hiring.
Really? Why not?
Well, they explain how unconscious biases can creep into those first impressions. And we end up with this, hiring-like situation. Instead of diversity, we get homogeneity.
So instead of bringing in fresh perspectives, we end up with teams that all think the same way.
Exactly. And by relying on gut feelings, we might miss out on really qualified people who just, don't feel right based on our own biases.
That makes sense. Is there any research on that?
Actually, there is. Studies show that interviewers often make snap judgments about candidates in the first 10 seconds and then spend the rest of the interview just trying to confirm that initial feeling.
So how do we avoid that trap and hire more fairly?
They suggest using structured interviews, focusing on actual skills and experience instead of those vague gut feelings.
That seems like a much better approach. Okay, let's move on to building psychological safety in teams. They share this story about almost derailing their whole book project because of a conflict over a chapter draft.
Oh, I remember that part.
It shows how disagreements, especially when they get personal, can really escalate quickly.
They make this distinction between task conflict, disagreeing about ideas or solutions, and relationship conflict, which is more about personality clashes and can be really damaging. They use this analogy of the Pixar movie Inside Out, where Riley's different emotions have to learn to work together even when they disagree.
I love that analogy. So for a team to function well, it's not about avoiding conflict altogether.
No, it's about managing it in a healthy way. And that's where psychological safety comes in. It's about creating an environment where people feel safe to express themselves without being judged or punished for it.
So it's about creating a space where conflict can be addressed openly and respectfully.
Exactly. They offer some tips on creating that kind of environment, like encouraging open discussions, inviting different perspectives, and having clear communication guidelines. Liz even shares her personal tips for running effective team meetings.
I'm always looking for ways to make meetings better. Okay, what about navigating difficult personalities? I think we've all worked with at least one bad apple.
Oh, absolutely. And they break down these difficult personalities into three types: jerks, dissenters, and slackers. And for each type, they have these, well, surprisingly specific strategies for dealing with them. Like with a jerk, they recommend reducing interaction, being empathetic, but not opening up too much personally, and keeping some distance.
It's a good reminder that we don't have to tolerate toxic behavior, even at work.
Right. And not everyone we dislike is automatically a jerk. Sometimes it's just a personality clash or a lack of understanding. With dissenters, it's about hearing them out, but setting boundaries.
Finding that balance between acknowledging their perspective and keeping things productive.
Exactly. Ask for clarification, counter negativity with positivity, and stay professional. Then with slackers, it's about figuring out the root cause of the behavior. Are they overwhelmed, confused, or dealing with personal stuff?
So address the issue, not just label them as lazy.
Exactly. They suggest things like dividing work into pairs for accountability, giving individual feedback, and involving managers when needed. We've talked about decision-making, psychological safety, and those difficult colleagues. What's left in no hard feelings?
Well, I'm curious about their advice on communication and leadership.
We still have to explore effective communication, building a positive emotional culture, and the power of vulnerability in leadership.
Sounds like we have a lot more to discuss. Join us for part 3 as we wrap up our deep dive into no hard feelings. Welcome back to our final installment on No Hard Feelings. We've covered so much ground, from personal well-being to managing difficult personalities. I'm really interested to see what else the authors have to offer.
Let's dive into communication. Your feelings aren't facts, which opens with a story about Tom Lehman, the Genius co-founder, having communication issues with his business partner, Elon.
What did they do?
They actually went to couples therapy.
Couples therapy for business partners. That's something else.
It shows how important communication is for any relationship, whether it's personal or professional. The authors point out that our feelings, while valid, aren't always an accurate reflection of what's actually going on.
That's a good point.
That's where they introduce emotional proofreading, especially for written communication, like emails. Before you send an email, especially about something important, reread it from the recipient's perspective.
Could they misinterpret it? Is the tone right?
Right. And the book also advises against relying solely on digital communication for really important conversations. Video calls, if you can, are better because you get more context.
I see what you mean. Body language, tone of voice, those things can make a big difference.
Exactly. And they even talk about the study where people tapped out rhythms of famous songs and the listeners had to guess the song. You'd think it'd be easy, but even with something so simple, there's so much room for miscommunication. It highlights how we tend to overestimate our ability to get our meaning across.
That's really interesting. Okay, let's move on to building a positive emotional culture. They use a great example here, The Devil Wears Prada. Miranda Priestley, the intense fashion editor, her behavior impacts everyone around her.
Right. It's like her whole team becomes guarded and less authentic because of her. It's what the authors call emotional contagion.
A leader's emotions can really set the tone.
Exactly. And they argue that fostering belonging is more than just diversity and inclusion. It's about making sure everyone feels valued, respected, and heard.
Creating an environment where people can truly be themselves.
And they have examples of companies that are doing this well. Like Buffer, they use Instagram stories to let their employees share personal stuff.
It's about building those human connections, even at work.
Exactly. Small actions can have a big impact. Now for the final section, leadership and selective vulnerability.
This is a topic that always gets people talking.
It sure does. They start by sharing a story about Laszlo Bock, former head of people operations at Google. He actually shared his grief about losing his brother with his team.
Wow. And that made him a weaker leader.
Quite the opposite. It actually strengthened his leadership. It made him more relatable, more human.
So vulnerability can actually be a strength.
They call it selective vulnerability. It's not about oversharing every detail of your life. It's about choosing the right moments to open up while still maintaining professionalism. Like, remember when Tim Cook Apple's CEO started having lunch with employees.
Or Simon Sinek's talk about creating safe spaces at work.
Those are great examples. They offer suggestions specifically for leaders. Focus on listening, manage up when you have to, and be aware of the emotional weight your team members are carrying.
We've learned so much from this deep dive into no hard feelings. From managing our own well-being, to navigating tricky situations with colleagues, to the power of vulnerability in leadership.
It's been quite a journey.
Before we wrap up, let's recap some key takeaways for our listeners.
Sounds good.
So here are 10 points to remember from No Hard Feelings. 1. Don't ignore emotions at work. They matter. 2. Take care of your well-being with breaks and rituals. 3. Clear expectations reduce anxiety. 4. Seek autonomy in your work whenever you can. 5. Connect your work to a greater purpose. 6. View work as a chance to learn and grow. 7. Build genuine connections with colleagues. 8. Be aware of emotions when making decisions, especially hiring choices. 9. Create a psychologically safe environment for yourself and your team. And 10. Practice selective vulnerability as a leader.
Those are some great takeaways. It's a lot to think about.
It is. As we end this deep dive into No Hard Feelings, we leave you with a question to ponder. How will you use these insights to become more effective and emotionally intelligent in your own career? Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.